What if I told you that the most significant war of the 20th century had no actual combat? A statement that seems to defy the very definition of war, yet perfectly encapsulates the chilling reality of the Cold War. In the mid-20th century, the world was polarized into two opposing camps, each led by a superpower with a radically different ideology and vision for the world. On one side of the divide stood the United States of America, a beacon of capitalism and democracy. Across the Iron Curtain, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics championed the cause of communism under a single-party state. Yet, this was not a war fought in battlefield trenches or over contested territories. There were no thundering charges of cavalry or roaring volleys of gunfire exchanged directly between the two principal actors. Instead, this was a war of ideologies, a war of influence, a war of espionage, and a war of attrition. It was a battle for hearts and minds, for economic dominance, for technological superiority, and for political control over the globe. At the heart of this conflict lay a profound and irreconcilable difference in worldviews. The United States, steeped in the principles of liberal democracy, sought to spread its ideals of freedom, individual rights, and capitalism. The Soviet Union, however, was steadfast in its belief in communism, striving for a world where wealth and power were shared equally among all people. These two superpowers, each with its sphere of influence, engaged in a high-stakes game of chess on the global stage. The pieces were not merely military units, but entire nations, governments, and ideologies. The moves were not physical attacks, but diplomatic maneuvers, clandestine operations, and propaganda campaigns. The Cold War was a war of nerves, a war of wills, a war of endurance. It was a silent war, a shadow war, an unseen war, yet its impact was far from invisible. It shaped the world as we know it today, influencing international relations, politics, culture, and even technology. The stage was set for a war like no other, spanning decades and continents, all without a single official battle. For this was the Cold War, a conflict unlike any other in human history. The seeds of this silent conflict were sown at the end of the most devastating war the world had ever seen. World War II had left the globe in ruins, and in its aftermath, two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. These nations, once allies against the Axis powers, found themselves at odds in a world that was desperately seeking peace and stability. The division of Germany into 4 occupied zones by the victorious powers planted one of the earliest seeds of the Cold War. Berlin, the capital, was also divided, even though it lay deep within the Soviet-controlled zone. This division was a stark representation of the ideological divide that was beginning to shape the world, a divide that would be famously referred to by Winston Churchill as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a metaphor, but a tangible reality. It was a physical and ideological barrier that separated the East from the West, communism from capitalism, the Soviet Union from the United States, and its allies. This curtain was the front line of the Cold War, a silent battle of ideologies, a war without direct combat between the two superpowers. The ideological differences were vast. The United States, a capitalist democracy, championed individual freedom, private property, and free market economics. The Soviet Union, a communist state, advocated for state control of resources and production, and the creation of a classless society. These two worldviews were diametrically opposed, and neither side was willing to compromise. The conflict wasn't just ideological, it was also technological and military. The end of World War II saw the dawn of the nuclear age, and both superpowers raced to develop and stockpile nuclear weapons, leading to the arms race. The world lived in fear of a nuclear war, a war that could potentially wipe out all of humanity. Thus, the world found itself split in two, each side convinced their way was the right one. The stage was set for a conflict that would last for over 4 decades, shaping the world as we know it today. But even a war without battles had its dramas and confrontations. In the shadowy theater of the Cold War, the world stage was set for a series of intense moments and proxy wars, each one a new act in the unfolding drama between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The tension reached a fever pitch during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This 13-day standoff was a high-stakes game of brinkmanship after the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, barely 90 miles from American shores. The world watched with bated breath as the two superpowers teetered on the edge of nuclear war. Thankfully, diplomatic negotiations prevailed and the crisis was averted, but it left an indelible mark on international relations. Then there was the space race, a celestial competition for supremacy. The Soviets drew first blood with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, but the Americans were not to be outdone. They responded with an ambitious pledge to put a man on the moon. In 1969, they achieved this feat, declaring a symbolic victory. In Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War raged for nearly 2 decades, a brutal and divisive conflict that was, in part, a proxy war. The United States intervened to support South Vietnam, hoping to contain the spread of communism championed by the Soviet-backed North. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and a unified Vietnam under communist rule. Lastly, the Korean War, another East versus West showdown, saw North and South Korea as the chessboard upon which the superpowers played their game. The conflict ended in a stalemate in 1953, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel. Through these events, the superpowers vied for dominance, each trying to prove its ideology superior. The Cold War was a conflict of ideologies, fought not on battlefields but through proxy wars, tense standoffs, and a race to the stars. It was an unseen war with very visible consequences. All wars must come to an end, and this one ended not with a bang, but with a wall. The year was 1989, a year that would become a beacon of change in the annals of history. The symbol of division, the Berlin Wall, was about to crumble. This massive concrete barrier stretching over 100 miles had stood for nearly 3 decades. It was more than just a physical barrier between East and West Berlin. It was a stark representation of the ideological chasm that had split the world into 2 power blocks. But as the 80s gave way, the winds of change began to blow. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, was undergoing significant reforms. Concepts like glasnost, or openness, and perestroika restructuring were slowly transforming the rigid Soviet system. The grip on Eastern Europe was loosening. On November 9, 1989, the unimaginable happened. The East German government announced that all citizens could visit West Germany and West Berlin. Crowds swarmed the wall, some danced atop it, others chipped away chunks as souvenirs. The world watched in disbelief as the Berlin Wall fell, not by force, but by the will of the people. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. The domino effect was swift and unstoppable. One by one, the countries of Eastern Europe broke away from Soviet control. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed, marking the official end of the Cold War. The significance of this peaceful ending cannot be overstated. A war that could have ended in nuclear annihilation concluded with the peaceful dissolution of an empire. It reshaped the geopolitical landscape and marked the beginning of a new era of cooperation and, hopefully, understanding. And so the longest war of the 20th century ended, not with a victor, but with change. Wars leave scars, and the Cold War was no exception. This confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, although largely void of direct military engagement, left a lasting impact that still reverberates in our current global landscape. The nuclear arms race, a dangerous legacy of the Cold War, continues to influence international relations. Even today, the shadow of nuclear warfare looms over us, as nations strive to maintain a balance of power through the acquisition and development of nuclear technology. The Cold War era saw the world balancing on the razor's edge of nuclear destruction. It was a time when the doomsday clock, a symbolic representation of how close we are to a global catastrophe, was at its most alarming. The ideological divide, another remnant of the Cold War, persists in many parts of the world. The struggle between capitalism and communism may have shifted gears, but it hasn't disappeared. We see it in the economic policies of nations, in the political debates that shape our society, and in the cultural narratives that define us. The Cold War also paved the way for the rise of the United States as the sole superpower. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of the bipolar world order, leaving the US unchallenged on the global stage. This has had profound implications for the world, influencing everything from international politics to economic trends. The Cold War, a period of intense geopolitical tension, altered the course of history and shaped the world as we know it. It was a war fought not on battlegrounds but in the minds of people and in the corridors of power. It was a war that taught us about the destructive potential of ideologies and the dire consequences of an unchecked arms race. The Cold War may be over, but its echoes can still be heard today.